Sometimes a mistake isn't a mistake at all. Sometimes it's destiny knocking on the wrong door at exactly the right time. Ezra Hawthorne was a mountain of a man, built by God to block out the sun. In the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, they didn't say his name. They just called him the Giant. When he walked down the street, spurs didn't jingle. There was no sound at all, just the sudden silence that falls when a legend passes through. At 7 feet tall, he moved with the careful grace of a man who knew his own size could shatter the world around him. He was a weapon, first, and a man second. He'd made his peace with that. Ranchers called him when words failed, and bullets were the only answer left. His mere presence could end a range war. He'd show up on a property line, silent and still, and the fight would just evaporate. Smart men knew some battles weren't worth fighting, but the work was a poison, seeping into his soul. Every job was another night alone under the stars, another town where he was feared, never welcomed. Loneliness was the one shadow he could never outrun. In his saddlebags, he carried a worn Bible that had belonged to his mother. She'd prayed her oversized son would use his strength to protect, not destroy. Her last words were a whisper about God making him big for a purpose. He rarely opened the book anymore. Faith was a luxury a man like him couldn't afford. Then the letter came. Cream-colored paper with gold trim, bearing the seal of Silas Drummond, the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory. Drummond was a legend of a different kind, a man who'd built an empire on ambition and ruthlessness. The message was simple. His daughter, Penelope, was in danger. Settlers were making threats. He needed the kind of protection only the Giant could provide. The pay was heavy, heavier than usual. But something about the job felt wrong from the start. The instructions were strange. Follow the north trail from Cedar Ridge. Find the cabin with the blue door and white fence posts. Protect the girl. No questions. Just do the job. Penelope was said to be as spoiled as she was beautiful. A city girl who'd never seen a real day's work. The whole thing smelled of a rich man's paranoia. But a job was a job. And Ezra always did his job. He rode north as the sun bled across the western mountains. The trail wound through aspen and pine, the land holding its breath. He thought of his mother, of a different kind of strength she'd talked about. The kind that builds things up. He'd been young then. He'd believed in things like that. The frontier had beaten it out of him. This was a country that rewarded violence, where might made right. Then he saw it. A small cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods. Through the dusk, he could just make out the blue door, the white fence posts. It was smaller than he expected, more a homesteader's shack than a rich girl's hideout. But the details matched perfectly. Smoke curled from the chimney. A warm yellow light glowed in the windows. It looked like a home. He dismounted, his joints aching from the ride. His hand brushed the butt of his sidearm, a reflex he'd never unlearned. He hoped he wouldn't need it. The last thing he wanted was to scare an already frightened woman. He knocked 3 times, firm but not threatening. He waited. He heard light footsteps, the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door opened slowly, and Ezra Hawthorne found himself looking down into the face of a woman who was nothing like he'd expected. She was maybe 30, with dark hair in a simple bun and eyes the color of autumn leaves. Her dress was plain, her hands were worn from work. Her face held a quiet strength, the kind that comes from enduring hardship without surrendering hope. And when she looked up at the 7-foot giant on her doorstep, there was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, shattering relief that made his chest ache. "Brother Thomas," she whispered, her voice a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming." She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please," she said, "come in." Ezra stood frozen. Brother Thomas. This woman wasn't Penelope Drummond. There was no pampered softness in her, only the simple dignity of a woman who had fought for every sunrise. Yet she had opened her door to him with such desperate hope, he couldn't find the words to shatter it. He couldn't bring himself to watch the light go out of her eyes. "Please," she said again, her voice pulling him from his confusion. "I know you must be tired. I have stew on the stove." He ducked his head to enter the small cabin, removing his hat. The inside was clean, simple. A fire crackled in the hearth. A wooden cross hung above the mantel. The whole place radiated a warmth that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a woman's will to make a home. "Ma'am, he started. "Miriam," she corrected gently, moving toward the stove. "Miriam Fletcher. I wrote to your mission society months ago. I wasn't sure the letter ever reached you." She ladled thick, rich stew into a bowl, her movements quick and efficient. She kept glancing at him, not with suspicion, but with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been praying for a miracle and was afraid to look away in case it vanished. Around her neck, on a thin gold chain, he saw something small and precious. "Mrs. Fletcher," Ezra began, his voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "I think there's been a mistake." "Oh, I know how I must look," she said quickly, setting the bowl on the rough wooden table. "A woman alone, trying to work land that's too much for her. Probably foolish for thinking God would send help." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "But you're here now. That's all that matters. You're here." He saw a faded wedding photograph on a small table. William, her late husband. This was a widow, struggling, who had mistaken him for a traveling preacher. The realization hit him like a fist to the gut. Not because of the mistake, but because of the pure, undiluted trust in her eyes. He should tell her the truth. He had to. But as she bustled around the small kitchen, her presence filling a space that was clearly too empty, the words caught in his throat. When was the last time anyone had been glad to see him? When had his arrival ever brought relief instead of fear? "Please, sit," she insisted. He lowered his massive frame onto the wooden chair, which groaned under his weight. The stew smelled better than anything he'd eaten in years. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked a meal for him, welcomed him into their home not for his gun, but for his company. "The work," he said slowly, picking his words like he was crossing a minefield. "It's been challenging. People are struggling." "That's what I'm facing," she said, taking a seat across from him. "The bank. I'm 3 months behind on the loan. They've given me until the end of the month, or they'll foreclose." Her voice was steady, but he saw the terror hiding behind it. "I keep praying for a miracle. When I heard about traveling preachers who help communities, I thought maybe—" She trailed off, a flush rising on her cheeks. "I'm sorry. You must think I'm a fool." "Not foolish," Ezra said, and he meant it. He tasted the stew. It was rich with vegetables and beef from her own small herd. It tasted like home. "Tell me about this place." The question opened a floodgate. As the shadows deepened, she told him about William, about their dream. They'd started with nothing but love and hard work, building a life in the wilderness. "William was so sure we'd have children," she said softly, her hand going to the chain at her throat. "He carved a cradle before we'd even been married a year." Her eyes filled with tears. But the blessing never came. 5 years, and our house stayed quiet. The pain in her voice was raw, the quiet grief of a dream that had died. When the fever took him last winter, I think part of him was relieved. He didn't have to pretend anymore. Ezra set down his spoon. His appetite was gone. "I'm sorry for your loss." "People in town say I should sell, move back east," she said. "But this land, it's all I have left of him." It was a wedding ring. That's what hung from the chain, her husband's ring. She wore it close to her heart. Ezra was drowning in his own deception, but a fierce, protective instinct rose up in him. "The bank," he said. "How much do you owe?" $300. The number hung in the air, heavy as a tombstone. It might as well have been $1 million. For Silas Drummond, it was pocket change. For Ezra, it was months of dangerous work. For this woman, it was the end of the world. "Mrs. Fletcher," he began, steeling himself to tell her the truth. "Miriam," she insisted. "And I know what you're thinking, but I believe God brought you here for a reason. If you could just bless the land, pray over it." She shook her head. "Listen to me," expecting miracles from a stranger. A gust of wind rattled the cabin windows. Miriam rose to add a log to the fire. In the flickering light, Ezra watched her, this strong, lonely woman, and wondered what it would be like to have someone believe in miracles enough for both of you. Outside, his horse nickered, a reminder of his real job, of Penelope Drummond, waiting somewhere in this valley. But here, in this warm cabin, watching Miriam Fletcher guard her fragile hope, Ezra found he couldn't leave. One night. He'd stay one night. What harm could it do? Dawn broke soft and quiet over the Fletcher homestead. Ezra had slept in William's chair by the fire, his large frame cramped but his mind strangely calm. The quiet sounds of the farm, of Miriam moving in the kitchen, were a music he'd never heard before. He stood at the window, watching the sun touch her struggling fields. When she emerged, already dressed for work, she smiled, a real smile that chased the worry from her eyes. "I was hoping you'd stay for breakfast," she said. "And maybe look at the property?" Every instinct screamed at him to leave. Find the real cabin, do the job. But watching her, he found himself nodding. The homestead was 40 acres of good land, rich soil, clear water, but everywhere he looked, he saw the signs of a woman working alone. Fence posts sagged, the barn roof was failing. William had said this land could support 50 head of cattle. Now there were only a dozen left. She'd sold the rest to bury her husband. In the barn, he saw it immediately. The main support beam was cracking. But tucked in a back corner, under a dusty blanket, was something else. A small, hand-carved cradle. The one William had made, full of hope for a future that never came. Miriam kept it, but she couldn't bear to look at it. The depth of her loss was a physical thing in the quiet barn. "Can I look at your roof?" he asked, changing the subject. Relief flooded her face. "I can't pay you." "I'm not asking for pay," Ezra said. "I'm offering." The words surprised him. When had he started thinking in terms of providence instead of paychecks? Looking at the hope in her eyes, he meant every word. They spent the morning walking the land. She knew every inch of it, every secret. "William used to say this place had good bones," she told him by the creek. He thought it could be something special. "He was right," Ezra said, cupping the cold, clear water in his hands. "This is good land." "If there were going to be generations to live on it," she said quietly. "But God had other plans." "Maybe God's plans aren't finished yet," he heard himself say. She turned and looked at him, and something passed between them. A recognition. Two broken people who had somehow found the courage to keep standing. It was a fragile, tentative moment. But it was real. For the first time in his life, Ezra felt no urge to be anywhere else. He felt like he was home. For 3 days, he worked. The sun beat down as he repaired the barn roof, his muscles straining with honest labor for the first time in years. Below, Miriam mended fences, hauled water, her movements becoming lighter, more hopeful with every passing hour. He still hadn't told her the truth. The lie had grown too big, too complicated. But mostly, he couldn't bear to see the light go out of her eyes. She was blooming under his care, under the simple presence of another person who believed in her. "You're different from what I expected in a preacher," she'd said that morning, a curious glint in her eye. "You know about cattle and carpentry. You handle tools like a man who's worked with his hands his whole life." He'd almost choked on his coffee. The mission field requires practical skills, he'd managed, hating the lie even as it saved him. Late that afternoon, he climbed down from the roof to find her holding a faded photograph. "This was William," she said, her voice soft. He took the picture. William Fletcher was a slight man with kind eyes, standing next to a younger, happier Miriam. They were squinting in the sun, full of a hope that now seemed impossibly tragic. "He was a good man," Ezra said, and he meant it. "He was," she agreed. "Sometimes I feel guilty for enjoying your company so much, as if I'm being disloyal." The words hung in the air, a confession and a question. She was telling him she felt something growing between them, something real. "A man who loved you that much would want you to find happiness again," he said carefully. Without thinking, he reached out and touched her shoulder. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, passed between them. They stood frozen, the space between them charged with unspoken feelings. "I should start dinner," she whispered, but she didn't move away from his touch. "Let me help," he said. They worked side by side in the small kitchen, a quiet, domestic dance. Miriam teaching him how to knead dough, her hands brushing his. In this simple kitchen, sharing quiet words, he found a contentment he'd never known. "Tell me about your calling," she said as they ate. "What made you decide to become a preacher?" The question blindsided him. "I suppose I've always felt drawn to helping people," he said, the partial truth feeling like the worst kind of lie. After dinner, they sat on the porch as the sky exploded in color. The air grew cool, and Miriam pulled a shawl around her shoulders. "Brother Thomas," she began, then stopped. "May I ask your given name?" Panic clawed at his throat. He couldn't say Ezra Hawthorne. The name was a curse in this territory, but another lie felt like a betrayal. "Thomas," he said. It was his middle name, a small piece of truth in a sea of deception. "Thomas," she repeated, tasting the sound of it. "It suits you, strong, but gentle." They sat in a comfortable silence, a peace he had never believed possible settling over him. "Thomas," she said quietly, "would you pray with me? For the harvest? For this place?" She wanted him to pray, to speak to a God he hadn't talked to in 20 years, a God he wasn't sure he still believed in. But looking at her face, shining with trust, he found himself nodding. They knelt together on the rough wooden porch. He closed his eyes, feeling like the biggest fraud in the world. And he began to speak. "Lord," he began, his voice rough, "we come before you with grateful hearts, for this land, for this home, for the chance to be of service to one another." The words came slowly at first, then found a rhythm. He asked for a blessing on the harvest, for protection over this place, and over Miriam, who had shown such courage. And as he spoke, something shifted inside him. The words, which began as a performance, became real. The gratitude for her, the plea for her happiness, it came from a place in his heart he thought had died long ago. "Amen," Miriam whispered when he finished, her eyes bright with tears. "Amen," he echoed. And for the first time since he was a boy, he meant it. A week passed. A rhythm settled over the homestead. They worked like partners who had known each other for years, not strangers bound by a mistake. The farm was coming back to life. Fences stood straight, the barn was sound. But more than that, Miriam was alive again. The worried, hollow look was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. And Ezra was a different man. His gun belt hung on a nail in the barn, gathering dust. He woke each morning with a purpose that had nothing to do with violence. One morning, he made a decision. He rode into Cedar Ridge. The town still fell silent as he passed, but for the first time, he wanted to be known as something other than the giant. He walked into the bank. The manager, a nervous man named Whitmore, nearly jumped out of his skin. "Mrs. Fletcher's loan," Ezra said, his voice flat. "How much to make it current?" $340, Whitmore stammered. "But Mr. Hawthorne, the woman has no means." Ezra reached into his vest and pulled out a leather pouch. It was most of his life's savings, money earned through years of being feared. He dropped it on the counter. "Will this cover it?" Whitmore's eyes went wide. He counted it, his hands shaking. "What is your interest in this matter?" the banker asked. Ezra met his gaze. "Mrs. Fletcher is under my protection now," he said. "See that she's treated accordingly." In 5 minutes he had answered Miriam's prayers. Her farm was safe. Next, he went to the post office and wrote a letter to Silas Drummond. "I will be unable to complete the assignment," he wrote. "I am returning your advance." He sealed the letter with the money. There was no going back. He had abandoned his reputation, his livelihood. Drummond was not a man who took kindly to being crossed. But riding back to the homestead, Ezra felt no regret. For the first time, he was choosing hope over fear. He found Miriam in the kitchen, humming as she kneaded bread. The sight of her, flour on her cheek, filled him with a tenderness that stole his breath. "I had business in town," he said. "Miriam, there's something I need to tell you." She saw the look on his face and stopped her work. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. It was time for the truth. "The bank loan," he began. "It's been paid. Your farm is safe." Her hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with shock. "Paid? How?" "I paid it," he said simply. Tears streamed down her face. She sank into a chair, overwhelmed. You saved my farm," she whispered. "But why? How could a traveling preacher have that kind of money?" This was it, the moment of truth. But before he could speak, she stood up, crossed the room, and placed her hands on his face. Her touch was gentle, sure. "I don't care," she said, her voice fierce and quiet. "Whatever brought you here, whoever you really are, I don't care. You've given me back my life, my hope." She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was soft and sweet, and full of a gratitude so profound it shattered him. He had been kissed before, but never like this. Never by someone who had seen the gentleness he kept hidden from the world. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Miriam," he whispered, her name a prayer. "Stay," she whispered back. "Whatever happens, just stay." They lived in a golden haze for 3 more days. They worked together, ate together, planned a future together. But the unspoken truths were a shadow between them. On the 4th morning, Miriam pulled out the now meaningless foreclosure notice. "I keep reading this," she said, "and thinking about how you saved me." She looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. "Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." His heart stopped. "Who are you really?" The question was gentle, but it cut him to the bone. "I'm not angry," she said. "But if we're going to build something together, it needs to be built on truth." He sat back, the weight of the moment crushing him. She deserved the truth, no matter the cost. "My name isn't Thomas," he began, his voice rough. "It's Ezra Hawthorne, and I'm not a preacher." He told her everything, about Silas Drummond, about the job to protect his daughter, about following the directions that led him, by a cruel twist of fate, to her door. "When you opened that door, you looked at me like I was an answer to a prayer, not a problem. No one has ever been glad to see me coming, Miriam." Her hand went to her husband's ring at her throat, a lifeline in a storm of revelation. "What kind of work do you do, Ezra?" she asked quietly. "What kind of man does Silas Drummond hire?" This was the part that would break them. "They call me the Giant," he said. "I settle disputes. I'm the man people cross the street to avoid. You're a gunfighter." It wasn't a question. Not exactly. But yes, I've made my living being the kind of man you've been praying to be saved from. He watched her absorb the blow, watched the woman he loved grapple with the knowledge that her gentle savior was a man of violence. Are you still working for Drummond? She finally asked. No. I sent him a letter 3 days ago. I quit. The only person I want to protect is you. She opened her eyes, and he saw a confusion of hurt and compassion in them. You lied to me, she said. Yes. You let me believe you were a man of God. Yes. Each admission was a nail in the coffin of their future. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land they had worked together. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I need time to think, Ezra. I need you to leave. Just for a while. The words were a physical blow, but he'd expected them. He'd hoped for a miracle, but his whole life was built on the absence of them. I understand, he said. The work you did, she asked, her back still to him. The money, your feelings for me, was any of it real? More real than anything else in my life, he said fiercely. Whatever else was a lie, Miriam, that was the truth. She nodded, not turning around. Then maybe there's hope for us. But I need time. He gathered his things and saddled his horse. As he mounted, she finally turned. Tears streamed down her face. Where will you go? Not far, he promised. I'll be close, if you need me. He rode away from the only home he'd ever known, the taste of happiness turning to ash in his mouth. He had lost her. Ezra made a cold camp in a grove of aspens, close enough to watch the cabin, far enough to give her the space she'd asked for. For 2 days, he watched and waited, the silence from the homestead a constant torment. He was back to being the man he'd always been, alone, watchful, his hand never far from his gun. On the 3rd morning, he heard it. Horses, too many of them, moving too fast. He scrambled up a tree, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. What he saw turned his blood to ice. 8 riders in dark coats, and at their head, a man whose expensive clothes couldn't hide his arrogance. Silas Drummond, and he had brought an army. They reined up in front of Miriam's cabin. Drummond dismounted, his men staying on their horses, their hands resting on their guns. Professionals. Killers. Miriam came out of the cabin. Even from a distance, Ezra could see her posture was straight, her chin high. She was afraid, but she would not show it. She spoke to Drummond, who grew angrier with every word. Then Drummond's voice carried on the wind, fragments of a nightmare. Told you before, not a request. One way or another. 2 of his men dismounted, flanking her. She was trapped. Ezra started down the tree, his mind racing. 1 man against 8. The odds were impossible, but they were threatening Miriam. That was all that mattered. Then he heard Drummond's next words, and the world stopped. The giant. You were hired to clear her out. You failed to complete the job. Clear her out. The words echoed in his skull. The horrible, sickening truth slammed into him. There was no daughter. There were no threats from settlers. The entire job had been a lie, a fabrication. Drummond had hired him to terrorize Miriam Fletcher, to drive her off her own land. The mistake, the wrong cabin, the blue door. It was no mistake at all. He'd been sent to the right place from the very beginning. He'd just been sent to do the wrong thing. He crept closer, hiding in the brush. Now he could hear everything. Those water rights are worth 10 times what this pathetic farm produces, Drummond was saying. The bank foreclosure should have worked, but someone paid off your loan. He unrolled a surveyor's map. Your property sits on the largest underground spring in this valley. The railroad is coming. Water will be worth more than gold. Ezra stared in horror. The map showed the Fletcher homestead sitting on an underground river, a source of unimaginable wealth, and Miriam had no idea. "Your husband knew," Drummond sneered. "William was a smart man. He found the geological surveys. That's why he bought this god-forsaken piece of land." Miriam's face was pale. "William never—" "He just said it had good bones?" Drummond laughed. "Mrs. Fletcher, your good bones are sitting on water rights worth $50,000. Did you really think I'd let that go because of one stubborn widow?" It all clicked into place. William had kept the secret to protect her, but in doing so, he'd left her vulnerable. "I hired Ezra Hawthorne to persuade you to leave," Drummond said, his voice dripping with venom. "The giant is very persuasive, but it seems Mr. Hawthorne developed an unfortunate attachment." One of the gunmen leaned down. "Boss, we could make this easy. An accident." "No," Drummond snapped. "I'm a businessman." He turned back to Miriam. "I'll give you $500 for the land. Take it and leave. Or refuse, and find out just how many accidents can happen on an isolated farm." Ezra had heard enough. He had been a pawn in a rich man's cruel game. The mistake that had saved her, that had given them both a chance at happiness, was about to be undone by the monstrous truth. But as he prepared to step out of the shadows, Miriam did something that stopped him cold. She drew herself up to her full height, looked Silas Drummond dead in the eye, and spoke with the quiet fury of a queen defending her throne. "Mr. Drummond," she said, her voice ringing with clarity, "you can go to hell." And in that moment, Ezra Hawthorne knew he was looking at the woman he would die for. Miriam's defiance hung in the air, a shocking testament to her strength. Drummond's face contorted with rage. "You are one woman, alone," he hissed. "No one to protect you, no one to hear you scream." Before he could finish, a new voice sliced through the tension, deep and calm. "The lady said no, Drummond. I believe that ends the negotiation." Every head snapped toward the tree line. Ezra Hawthorne stepped into the clearing. He was no longer the quiet helper, the gentle Thomas. He was the giant. 7 feet of controlled fury, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. The morning sun cast his shadow long and dark across the ground, a declaration of war. "Ah, the giant," Drummond sneered, though his voice trembled. "Come to collect your payment?" "I came to collect something," Ezra said, his eyes locked on Drummond. "But it's not your money." He saw the hurt and confusion in Miriam's eyes as she realized he and Drummond knew each other. It was a fresh betrayal, another lie revealed. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, never taking his eyes off Drummond's men. "Go inside. Find your husband's Bible. Look for any papers hidden in it. Maps, deeds, anything." "Ezra, what is happening?" she pleaded. "Your husband knew what this land was worth," he explained quickly. "He knew men like Drummond would come for it. He hid the proof." Drummond laughed. "It doesn't matter what she finds. Documents can be destroyed, especially when the owner is no longer around to object." The threat was unmistakable. This was no longer about business. It was about elimination. "Miriam," Ezra said softly, "please, and load your husband's rifle." She hesitated, then saw the cold certainty in his eyes. She nodded and ran into the cabin. 8 against 1, Hawthorne," Drummond taunted. "Even for you, those are bad odds." "Depends on what you're fighting for," Ezra replied. "Your men are here for money. I'm here for something more." As if on cue, riders appeared on the horizon. Not Drummond's men. Neighbors. Sam Morrison from the north, the Kellerman brothers, old Pete Kowalski. They rode up and formed a line behind Ezra, their faces grim, their rifles ready. "Word travels fast when Silas Drummond rides through with hired guns," Sam Morrison called out. The odds had just changed. Suddenly, Drummond's 8 killers were facing a dozen angry homesteaders fighting for their homes. From inside the cabin, there was a triumphant shout. I found it, Ezra! I found it! Miriam emerged, clutching the old Bible and a folded document. Her face was flushed with discovery. William did know. He had it all documented, the mineral and water rights, all legal. She glared at Drummond, her fear replaced by righteous fury. My husband was protecting our future. Drummond's face went white. A legal deed meant lawyers, courts, publicity. His plan was falling apart. This changes nothing, he blustered. You can't afford to fight me in court. She won't be fighting alone, Sam Morrison said. Drummond turned his attention back to Ezra, his eyes glittering with malice. Mr. Hawthorne, we need to discuss your employment. You failed to do your job. In fact, you worked against me. The weight of his past settled on Ezra. Everyone was watching. Miriam, the neighbors, even Drummond's men. I quit, Ezra said simply. The job, the reputation, all of it. It's not that simple, Drummond smiled, a cold reptilian smile. Walking away from me has consequences. It complicates a man's life, permanently. The threat was clear. Even if they won today, Drummond would never stop. He would hunt them, use his money and power to crush them. Loving Miriam had made Ezra a target for the rest of his life. But standing there, beside the woman he loved, surrounded by good men, Ezra felt something he had never felt before. He felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Drummond, he said, his voice carrying across the homestead. If you want this water, you're going to have to go through all of us. In the distance, a church bell began to ring, the real Brother Thomas calling the town to service. But the sound was no longer a call to prayer. It was a rallying cry. The battle for Miriam Fletcher's future and Ezra Hawthorne's soul was about to begin. The church bell rang on, a bronze voice of judgment over the valley. Drummond's face was a mask of pure hatred. His plan, his fortune, was slipping through his fingers. This is your last chance, Fletcher, he snarled. Take the $500 and walk away. Miriam stepped forward, holding the deed like a shield. The rifle Ezra had told her to load was leaning just inside the open cabin door. Mr. Drummond, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. My husband died for this land. I have fought to survive on it. And these people, she gestured to her neighbors, are my friends. We are not for sale. Drummond's facade shattered. Some lessons can only be taught with blood, he spat, stepping back toward his horse. It was the signal. The lead gunman, a man with dead eyes, began to draw his weapon. He was a professional, smooth and deliberate. But Ezra was faster. The sound of his Colt clearing leather was a crack of thunder. Before the gunman's weapon was even halfway out, he was staring down the barrel of the giant's pistol. The other 7 froze. I said, call them off, Ezra repeated, his voice deadly calm. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, the silence was broken by more horses. The real Brother Thomas, leading what looked like half of Cedar Ridge, armed and angry. Your odds keep getting worse, Drummond, Sam Morrison said with grim satisfaction. Drummond's smile was a terrifying thing. On the contrary, he said, I think they just got much better. The first shot didn't come from the men in front of them. It came from a sniper Drummond had hidden behind the barn. The bullet screamed past Ezra's head, and the quiet morning exploded into a symphony of gunfire. Ezra tackled Miriam, pulling her behind the porch as wood splintered around them. Stay down, he yelled, but she was already crawling toward the rifle. The homesteaders scattered, returning fire. It was chaos. But then, Miriam did something no one expected. She emerged from the cabin with William's rifle, ran to the small cemetery next to the house, and took cover behind the wooden cross on her husband's grave. She began firing, her shots methodical and deadly accurate. Miriam, get back! Ezra shouted. This is my land! She screamed back, working the rifle's action with practiced skill. My husband died for it, and I will not let them take it. Splinters flew from the cross, but she held her ground, a lone woman defending her home and her husband's memory. Ezra grinned through the smoke and terror. This was the woman he loved. Not a broken widow, but a warrior. Drummond's men were professionals, though. They regrouped, laying down suppressing fire. The sniper kept the homesteaders pinned down. "Hawthorne!" Drummond yelled from behind his buggy. "End this, and I'll let you and the woman walk." Ezra's answer was a bullet that shattered the buggy's wheel. The battle raged, the tide shifting with every volley. Then Brother Thomas did something extraordinary. He began to ring a large brass bell he'd brought from the church. The clear, powerful sound cut through the noise of the gunfight. It was a sound of faith, of community, of defiance. The homesteaders rallied to it, their fire becoming more coordinated. Drummond's hired guns faltered, unnerved by the bell that seemed to announce their damnation to the entire world. "That's enough!" Brother Thomas's voice boomed across the field. "Silas Drummond, you are committing murder on holy ground!" In the brief lull, Miriam stood up from behind the splintered cross. "Mr. Drummond," she called out, "you came to terrorize a woman you thought was helpless, but you underestimated what people will do when they are fighting for everything that matters." Drummond rose from behind his ruined buggy, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over, Fletcher! I will have that water!" But his voice lacked conviction. His men were already looking for a way out. "Yes, it is over," Ezra said, stepping out from cover, his gun leveled at Drummond's heart. "You lost the moment you decided to steal from good people." And the church bell rang and rang, a celebration of justice in the clear Montana air. 3 months later, the Fletcher homestead was transformed. Fences were mended, the barn was solid, and the cattle herd had more than doubled. But the biggest change was in the two people who now worked the land as one: Ezra and Miriam. The battle had forged them into a partnership as strong as steel. Silas Drummond was a ruined man. Exposed in court, his empire crumbled. The water rights were confirmed to belong to Miriam, but she had entered into a partnership with her neighbors, ensuring the prosperity of the entire valley, not just one man. Brother Thomas was a regular visitor, a true friend who had stood with them in the fire. And on this crisp December morning, he was there to marry them. "Are you nervous?" Miriam asked as they finished the morning chores. Ezra considered it. He was no longer the giant. He was Thomas, the name she still called him, a name that felt more real than his own. He was taking her name, becoming Thomas Fletcher. The legend of Ezra Hawthorne was just a ghost story now. "Not about marrying you," he said. "But I keep thinking, what if I'd found the right cabin that first night?" She smiled, a light that could warm the coldest winter. "But you did find the right cabin, Thomas. You just didn't know it." Guests began to arrive. Sam Morrison, the Kellermans, old Pete Kowalski, the community that had stood with them, come to witness the new life they were all building together. The ceremony was on the front porch, the very spot where she had mistaken a killer for a preacher. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, speaking of faith, second chances, and the promise of a shared future. "I promise," Ezra said, slipping a simple silver ring he had forged himself onto her finger, "to be worthy of the trust you placed in a stranger, and to love you not just for who you are, but for who you've helped me become." When Brother Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up that seemed to shake the mountains. The giant had finally found his home. The lonely widow had found her miracle. They had discovered that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as the very mistakes that feel like the end of the world. If this story of a mistake that became a miracle touched your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because the stories we have coming are going to change the way you see the world.